Thank you so much, Father Piotr, for this kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to come here to this beautiful city of Torun. It's very appropriate, I think, to have an interdisciplinary conference in the home of Copernicus. It's a great place and an honor to be here. And thank you to all the organizers of this workshop. Okay, so my topic is natural selection, scarcity and evil, reflections on the fittingness of evolution as a divine instrument of creation. And you often heard it said that our current knowledge of the evolutionary process and evolutionary history makes the problem of evil worse. That's kind of a common claim. And already Charles Darwin harbored such suspicions. In a letter to his friend J.D. Hooker, he wrote, "What a book a devil's chaplain might write on the clumsy, wasteful, blundering, low, and horridly cruel works of nature." What Darwin had in mind as a potential challenge against God's existence or goodness was the enormous amount of suffering, premature death, and extinction that are associated with the evolutionary process. More recently, the biologist David Hull has expressed this evolutionary challenge against theistic and especially Christian belief thus, quote, "What kind of God can one infer from the sort of phenomena epitomized by the species on Darwin's Galapagos Islands? The evolutionary process is rife with happenstance, contingency, incredible waste, death, pain, and horror. Whatever the God implied by evolutionary theory and the data of natural selection may be like, he is not the Protestant God of waste not, want not. He is also not the loving God who cares about his productions. He is not even the awful God pictured in the book of Job. The God of the Galapagos is careless, wasteful, indifferent, almost diabolical. He is certainly not the sort of God to whom anyone would be inclined to pray." So if we put on our analytic glasses and look at this quote, we can see that Hall points to two different alleged problems for theists. And the first is often referred to as the problem of animal suffering, which Hull expresses by talking about the death, pain, and horror that accompanies the evolutionary process. However, although animal suffering might present a problem for theists, this problem has virtually nothing to do with evolutionary theory, I would say. After all, it was not Darwin who discovered that nature is red in tooth and claw, and that animal life is a struggle. People have, of course, always known this. So what evolutionary theory has contributed is the insight that animals have been around and suffered for much longer time than people previously thought. This knowledge, however, is irrelevant for the question of whether God was morally justified in creating animals and permitting them to suffer in the way that they do. Either the existence of animals that prey on each other is a good thing or it is not. If it is a good thing, then why would it not also be good for animals to exist for millions of years? If the existence of animals is not a good thing, on the other hand, then it does not matter whether they have been around for a short or a very long time, since a good God should not have created them at all, or at least he should not have let them suffer in the way they do. So if there is a specific evolutionary challenge against theistic belief, it must be something else than the problem of animal suffering. And if we look at the quote by Hull that I just read, he also points to another problem, and this problem might fit the bill. It concerns the way that evolution works, and we may call this problem or challenge the prima facie unfittingness of natural selection as a method of the divine creation. So natural selection drives the evolutionary process by separating winners from losers in the competition for survival and reproduction. The elimination of the losers in this competition is a necessary condition for the development of advanced biological adaptations through evolution. As Holmes Rolston puts it, the cougar's fang has carved the limbs of the fleet-footed deer and vice versa. A process that builds biological complexity by eliminating the less well-adapted can seem to conflict with the character of a perfectly good and loving God, especially as portrayed in the Christian tradition. Natural selection means that the fittest will inherit the earth rather than the humble, and this can seem to undermine or threaten belief in a God who, like the biblical God, cares especially for the poor, the sick, and the oppressed. According to Friedrich Nietzsche, Christianity, quote, thwarts the whole law of evolution, which is the law of natural selection. It preserves whatever is ripe for destruction. It fights on the side of those disinherited and condemned by life, unquote. Perhaps then, it is the fact that evolution happens through natural selection that presents a problem for the theists, and that we should focus on in the present context. Is a process of this kind morally appropriate or fitting as an instrument of creating for the Christian God? In this talk, I will argue for an affirmative answer. There is nothing about the evolutionary process that exacerbates the problem of evil or presents good evidence against belief in the Christian God. I will begin to make my case by taking a closer look at the phenomenon of natural selection and its relationship to another important force in evolutionary development, namely natural cooperation. So natural selection is something that happens when self-replicating systems such as biological organisms interact. Replication is always imprecise to some extent, which means that different variants of replicators will arise. If this random variation affects their replication rate, then some variants will increase in frequency relative to others, and this is what natural selection means. The only attribute that is directly selected is higher replication rate, in the sense that this attribute is what causes a variant to increase in frequency relative to other variants. In its essence, therefore, natural selection is a wholly harmless process that can happen without the elimination of the less fit. In a very benign environment where the resources needed for replication are unlimited, for example in a laboratory setting, all variants of replicators will be able to replicate at their own different rates. And those that replicate faster will become more prevalent in the population. They will, in other words, be selected. The losers in this selection process, however, are only losers in a relative sense. They will gradually constitute a smaller and smaller percentage of the total population, even though they might, under these very benign circumstances, not decrease in number and can even increase in absolute numbers. Of course, in nature, there is no benign environment of this kind. When organisms reproduce outside of a laboratory setting, there will sooner or later always be a shortage of the resources they need. This means that different lines of replicators must take resources from each other in order to continue to replicate. Competition will thus arise and the losers will be eliminated. It is therefore scarcity of resources that creates the struggle for existence that Darwin talks about. If God can be accused of anything in this context, it is not that he permits natural selection, but that he permits scarcity. Competition for scarce resources, however, is also what drives the evolution of biological complexity. And we can see this by looking at an example. The simplest kind of replicators are RNA viruses. And if these are cultured in a tube, where the supply of the resources they need for replication is abundant, the viruses will become smaller and smaller. Since smaller molecules will replicate more rapidly than larger ones, and replication rate is the only attribute that is primarily or directly selected by natural selection. However, if they exist in a natural state outside of the laboratory tube, RNA viruses must be more complex since they must infect bacteria in order to be able to replicate. In general, when the resources are scarce, success to replicate depends on an organism's ability to seize resources from competitors, thus preventing them from replicating. This drives the evolution of abilities and traits that are useful for scavenging from and outmaneuvering others, and this is an important explanation of the emergence of biological complexity. However, competition for scarce resources is only one side of the story about how complex organisms have evolved. Already in 1902, Peter Kropotkin wrote, "Beside the law of mutual struggle, there is the law of mutual aid, which for the success of the struggle for life, and especially for the progressive evolution of the species, is far more important than the law of mutual contest." End of quote. The mathematical biologist Martin Nowak has studied the relationship between competition and cooperation in the evolutionary process. He describes the central question within his field of research in this way. Evolution is based on fierce competition between individuals and should therefore only reward selfish behavior. Every gene, every cell, every organism should be designed to promote its own evolutionary success at the expense of its competitors. Yet we observe cooperation on many levels of biological organization. Genes cooperate in genomes, cells cooperate in multicellular organisms. There are many examples of cooperation among animals. The question of how natural selection can lead to cooperative behavior has fascinated evolutionary biologists for several decades. By natural cooperation, Nowak and his research collaborators mean, quote, "a form of working together in which one individual pays a cost in terms of fitness, whether genetic or cultural, and another gains a benefit as a result." Cooperation can enhance the fitness of individuals and groups, but there is a conflict of interest between the individual and the group that can be characterized in terms of social dilemmas, such as the prisoner's dilemma. Dilemmas of this kind are very common in nature and occur every time there is a cooperative arrangement whose benefits an individual can enjoy even while defecting from the cooperative enterprise. In the simplest version of the prisoner's dilemma, selection always favors defectors over cooperators in populations where those two categories are well mixed. This means that natural selection slowly increases the number of defectors until all cooperators are gone. However, this is disadvantageous for the group as a whole, which gets a higher average fitness through extensive cooperation. How then can cooperation ever arise? Nowak points to a number of mechanisms that can solve dilemmas and generate cooperation. The most well-known mechanism here is kin selection, which can induce individuals that are genetically related to pay a cost in order to help each other. Two other mechanisms that Nowak mentions are network reciprocity and multi-level selection. Network reciprocity means that cooperators can increase their fitness by forming network clusters with each other and exclude individuals who are not willing to cooperate on equal terms. Such networks make cooperative behavior more rewarding than it would be in a well-mixed population where cooperators and defectors encounter each other randomly. The other mechanism here, multi-level selection, is more commonly known as group selection. If a population is subdivided into groups, there will be competition not only among the individuals in each group, but also between the groups themselves. This means that selection will act both on the level of individuals and on the level of groups. On the individual level, selection favors defectors, while on the group level, selection favors cooperators, since groups with many cooperators flourish and grow faster than other groups. If a group reaches a certain size, it may split, and if the resources are limited, this means that some other less successful group becomes extinct. Through this mechanism, cooperative behavior can lead to evolutionary success. So according to Nowak, mechanisms such as these explain, quote, how cooperation arises out of competition, even though the two are locked together in ceaseless conflict. Nowak describes the principle of cooperation as the architect of evolution because it can draw living matter upward to higher levels of organization. Quote, cooperation built the first bacterial cells, then higher cells, then complex multicellular life and insect superorganisms. Finally, cooperation constructed humanity. Okay, what implications does all this have then for the problem of whether the evolutionary process is a fitting or morally appropriate instrument of divine creation? I think there are two lessons we can extract. First, we have seen that natural selection in its essence merely means that the replication rate of different organisms vary. Evils such as extinction and struggle for life are aspects of the process of natural selection that only arise under conditions of scarcity. It is scarcity of resources that transforms a competition to reproduce into a struggle for existence where winners take all. This means that our knowledge of the fact that organisms evolve by natural selection does not add some new and sinister aspect to the old problem of natural evil, so to speak. People have, as I've already mentioned, always known that animals and other organisms compete for scarce resources and that the losers in this competition perish. When the biologist David Hull, whom I quoted initially, appeals to the phenomenon of natural selection as a reason for disbelief in God, he is therefore wrong in my opinion. If something is a reason for disbelief in God in the present context, it is the fact that biological creatures must compete for scarce resources. However, a second lesson we can learn from the previous reflections is that competition naturally gives rise to cooperation in nature through the kinds of mechanisms I have just described. It is the very fact that organisms compete for scarce resources that makes cooperation between organisms rational in terms of fitness. If resources were infinite, organisms would not need to cooperate in order to sustain themselves and reproduce, and this would entail less complexity in nature. As Novak puts it, like day and night, or good and bad, cooperation and competition are forever entwined in a tight embrace. What this means is that evolutionary theory actually makes the problem of evil in nature less serious than it was prior to the discovery of evolutionary mechanisms. Previously, we knew that nature operated under conditions of scarcity that give rise to fierce competition. Now, we also know that this competition not only has bad consequences such as death and extinction, but that it also is the driving force behind the evolution of cooperation and complexity. This means that we are in a better position to explain why God permits scarcity of resources in nature than people were prior to the discovery of natural selection and the evolutionary mechanisms behind natural cooperation. So in the remainder of this talk, I will suggest two possible explanations of why God permits scarcity in nature, one traditional explanation and one that draws on evolutionary theory. And the two explanations I will suggest are compatible with each other, and theists and Christians can appeal to both. The traditional explanation is that the kind of biological organisms that actually exist in our world, including those that have existed throughout evolutionary history, could not have existed under natural conditions without competing for scarce resources. The reason for this is that biological species constitute each other's necessary resources. In other words, they feed on each other. The gazelle, for example, is a vital resource for the lion, which means that the two species necessarily compete. God could, of course, have created only herbivores, or he could have created the species that presently exist in our world, but let them live under non-natural conditions, for example, by separating the lions from the gazelles and miraculously feeding the lions, and so on. However, it is not at all obvious that a world with only herbivores, or a world where organisms exist under non-natural conditions, would be preferable or more valuable than the present natural world. Thomas Aquinas seems to think that this provides an explanation of why God permits death and corruption in nature. Aquinas writes, "It belongs to his providence to permit certain defects in particular effects, that the perfect good of the universe may not be hindered. A lion would cease to live if there were no slaying of animals," and so on. So the intrinsic value of the present predator-containing ecosystem is a reason that God could have for allowing scarcity and strife, because the present ecosystem necessarily entails these phenomena. But God could also have another reason to allow scarcity to arise in nature, or to set things up in a way that makes scarcity unavoidable. It can namely be argued that a creation that is allowed to create itself to some extent through an evolutionary process is more valuable than a creation that is directly created by God. What I mean by self-creation in this context is that nature is allowed to evolve in accordance with natural principles and laws, from a primitive state to a more complex state through causal interactions between things. Many contemporary thinkers have claimed that a world that evolves in this way is more valuable than a ready-made world, so to speak. However, I think the Dominican theologian and biologist Nicanor Austriaco has defended this claim in a particularly interesting way by reference to the traditional idea that creation's purpose is to manifest God's goodness and perfection outside of God. Austriaco points out that one of God's perfections is his causal agency, his status as first cause. Creation can participate in this divine perfection by exercising secondary causality. If creation is allowed to structure itself through immanent causal mechanisms, then creation exercises more secondary causality and therefore participates more or more deeply in God's creative causality than if God does all the structuring directly by himself, so to speak. Since it is by participating in God's perfections, by reflecting God through analogical likeness, that creation manifests God's goodness and glory, it follows that the creation that is allowed to structure itself through immanent causal mechanisms manifests God's glory and perfection to a higher degree than a creation that is not allowed to structure itself in this way. Since it is the purpose of creation, we assume, to manifest God's goodness, it follows that the capacity to structure itself makes the world more valuable. Now, evolution by natural selection is the only way we know of through which nature could create itself in this sense. Moreover, as we have seen, it is only under conditions of scarcity that natural selection gives rise to cooperation between biological entities and thus to complexity, because complexity is a form of biological cooperation, you can say. Hence, if God could create a world where organisms do not feed on even if God could create a world where organisms do not feed on each other and do not compete with each other for food in other ways, such a world could probably not be self-creating in the sense just explained. At least we have no way of seeing how this could possibly work. Such a world would not be causally involved in its own structuring and hence not participate in God's goodness as first cause to the same degree as the present evolutionary world. So this second possible explanation of why God has set up nature in a way that necessarily results in scarcity of resources and competition was not available before the advent of evolutionary theory. Before the discovery of evolution, it was well known that nature is set up in a way that causes scarcity, competition, and strife. And as we have seen, it's the fact of scarcity that is at the heart of the problem of evolutionary evil, rather than the principle of natural selection, which in itself is wholly innocuous. This means that the often heard claim that I started this lecture with, namely that evolution makes the problem of evil worse, seems to be false, in my opinion. Instead, it seems that our knowledge of evolutionary mechanisms gives us resources to address the problem of natural evil in a more satisfactory way than was the case before the advent of evolutionary theory. Okay, I'll stop there and thank you for listening.